Winter smothered the town in ice and snow. At -10 degrees Celsius, a single mistake could mean freezing to death. In the empty night, 3 shadows moved in silence. A wounded mother German shepherd leading her puppies toward shelter with the last of her strength. When her legs finally failed, she could only curl her body around them, shielding their tiny hearts from the killing cold. A lonely Navy SEAL opened his cabin door and froze, unable to believe what he saw. A mother dog and her puppies dying on his porch. He carried them into the firelight, not knowing this small act of mercy was about to change everything. Because when loneliness and the memory of his late wife nearly broke him, those fragile lives would become the reason he kept going. Where are you watching from? Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow the full story with us. The night had the kind of cold that made sound brittle. At 10 below, even the wind seemed to move carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. Snow pressed against the windows of the cabin on the ridge above Brindlewood, Minnesota, the flakes thick and slanted, the world beyond reduced to a white hush. Wyatt Wren Callahan stood at the sink, rinsing a mug he had forgotten to drink from, when he heard it. Not a knock, not a bark, but something smaller, a faint rasp of claws against wood, as if the porch itself were being asked, politely, to let someone live. He paused, head tilting, the way he used to when he'd listened for trouble on patrol. 40 years old, 6'1", broad-shouldered, without being bulky, he still moved with the economy of a man who had learned to waste nothing, not time, not motion, not feeling. His face, clean-shaven and angular, held the quiet of long winters. Dark hair kept in a neat undercut-framed eyes the color of winter sky, blue-gray and watchful. A dull ache settled into his left shoulder, the old injury waking at the promise of colder air. He set the mug down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and crossed the room. The door resisted him, a crust of ice along the jamb. When it gave, it opened onto a world erased. Snow drifted in over the threshold and onto the mat, and with it a smell of cold metal and wet fur. On the porch lay a German shepherd, female, 3 years old by the look of her, large and powerfully built, even in collapse. Her coat was black and tan, darker than most along the spine, the thick winter fur matted at the haunch with blood. One hind leg was tucked at an angle that made Wyatt's breath hitch. The injury was fresh, angry. She was on her side, ribs lifting in a shallow, careful rhythm, amber eyes half-lidded but not unfocused. Between her forelegs, pressed tight to her chest as if they were part of her own heart, were 2 tiny shapes. Puppies, perhaps 3 weeks old, their muzzles pink at the edges, their small bodies trembling with a cold that had already begun to take from them what little they had to give. The mother had dragged them here. He could see the tracks in the snow where she had tried to keep moving, then could not. Only a few hundred yards from whatever had broken her, the porch light had been enough. It always was. Wyatt did not think of heroics. He thought of heat, of circulation, of the way bodies failed when cold made the blood retreat. He had never owned a dog, had never wanted to. Life had been quieter that way, and he had learned to mistrust anything that asked to be loved when he still did not know what to do with his own grief. But he had carried men out of snowfields, pressed life back into fingers that had gone gray, held pressure where pressure was the only language left. He knelt, slid his arms beneath the shepherd's chest and hips, with care not to torque the injured leg, and felt the weight of her, a living weight, heavy and present. She did not snarl. Her ears twitched once, a reflex, then she let him lift her. One of the puppies squeaked, a thin sound like the hinge of a small door. Wyatt gathered both into the crook of his arm, their heat almost gone, and backed into the cabin. Inside, the stove was already warm. He laid the mother on a blanket by the hearth, positioning her so the heat would rise into her flank without burning. The puppies he placed against his chest first, inside the front of his jacket, feeling their shivers through the fabric. He spoke to them without knowing he was doing it, low and steady, the cadence he had used for men who could not hear him anymore, but still needed to be told to stay. He wrapped them in a towel, then returned to the mother, assessing with his hands. The wound on the thigh was torn, not clean, the bleeding slowed by cold, but not stopped. He fetched his kit from the hallway, bandages, antiseptic, the same supplies he kept for himself, and worked with the practiced gentleness of someone who knew that panic was contagious. She watched him with one eye, the amber dark and deep, not trusting but choosing, for now, not to resist. He cleaned, pressed, wrapped. He tested the paw below the injury. The reflex was there. Good. For the puppies, he warmed water, checked temperature with the back of his wrist the way he always had, then searched the cupboard for milk and cursed softly when all he found was half a carton of almond. He stood there a second, absurdly frozen, then huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had not caught on something sharper. He diluted what he had, improvised a dropper from a clean syringe, and knelt again, coaxing the smallest mouth to latch. He timed their breathing as if disarming a device, counting, watching for the moment when cold would make the rhythm stutter. The shepherd's head lifted a fraction, eyes following his hands. In that look was a calculus older than any of his training. Threat versus care, fear versus the possibility of mercy. She let him feed them. At one point he realized he was talking to her too, apologizing for the clumsiness of a man who could stop bleeding in the dark but had never learned how to be gentle with something so breakable. She blinked, slow, and the tension in her shoulders eased enough that he could see the outline of the muscles beneath the fur, the architecture of a body built for work and endurance. When he adjusted the blanket, she made a sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a whine, more a reminder that she was still in charge of what was hers. He nodded to her as if she were a fellow soldier. Fair. The cabin smelled now of clean wool, antiseptic, and wet dog. Snow ticked against the windows like 1,000 small clocks. Wyatt set a thermometer near the puppies, then sat back on his heels, the ache in his shoulder a familiar pulse. He caught himself smiling, the humor as dry as the winter air at the sight of his own hands, steady, scarred, trying to cradle two lives that could fit into a single glove. He thought of the word ready, the way he had always been. He had kept his belt with its pouches and holster even after he'd stopped wearing a uniform, had kept the watch with the black face and steel band because it was a promise to himself that he would not drift. He had been ready for everything except this. About a third of the way through the long night, when the puppy's breathing finally steadied into something like sleep and the shepherd's eyes closed for more than a blink, something happened that made him look up. He had risen to fetch more towels when the mother, still weak, shifted and nudged at the low drawer beneath the small table by the window. It was not a random movement. She pressed again, insistently, with the side of her muzzle, until the drawer slid an inch. Wyatt frowned, heart ticking faster for reasons that had nothing to do with blood loss. He crossed the room and pulled it open. Inside lay a single thing, a folded scarf, soft with age, pale blue, the fabric worn thin at the edges where fingers had worried it. It had belonged to his wife. He had not touched it in years. The shepherd watched him, eyes open now, alert in a way that was not pain. It was not that she knew what the scarf meant. It was that she had chosen that place, that object, that exact gesture. In the hush of the storm, the moment felt less like coincidence than like being addressed. Wyatt sat on the floor with the scarf in his hands. Memory did not crash. It rose, slow and unavoidable, the way she used to wrap it twice around her neck, the way she had laughed when snow got in her boots on the last winter they had shared. He had learned to keep his grief in a room with the door closed, to live beside it without opening it. Now the door was ajar, and instead of the sharpness he expected, there was a warmth that did not burn. He folded the scarf and placed it gently over the shepherd's shoulders, careful not to disturb the bandage. She did not move it away. She sighed, a sound like the wind laying down its arms. The rest of the night passed in increments. He fed the puppies when they stirred, adjusted the blanket when the fire dimmed, pressed 2 fingers to the mother's chest to feel the steady proof that she was still here. Once, near dawn, she woke with a start and tried to stand, the injured leg giving beneath her. He was there before she could fall, one hand bracing her chest, the other supporting her hip, murmuring the only truth he had. "You're safe. You're safe. You're safe." She leaned into him for half a heartbeat, then caught herself, dignity reasserted, eyes never leaving his. Outside, the storm spent itself. The sky shifted from black to a thin, silvered gray, the kind of light that makes the world look newly made. Wyatt rose, joints protesting, and opened the door a crack to let the air in. The porch was buried. The tracks that had led to it were already disappearing. He closed the door again, sealing the small, warm world he had made. He looked down at the 3 bodies by the stove. The mother, now breathing deeper, the puppies tucked so close they were indistinguishable from one another, and felt for the first time in years the weight of something like purpose settle where his loss had been. He did not yet know the names he would give them, or the trouble that would come with choosing not to look away when a life was placed on his threshold. He knew only this. The night had asked, quietly, for help, and he had answered. And in the answering, something in him had shifted, not back to what he had been, but forward into a shape he had not yet learned. The shepherd opened one eye, amber catching the light, and held his gaze. Between them passed no oath, no grand promise, only a shared understanding as old as storms, and as simple as a door opened when someone is freezing. Morning did not arrive all at once. It thinned the darkness the way breath thins fog. Wyatt eased the truck down the ridge road toward Brindlewood, wipers whispering back and forth, the world rinsed clean, but not forgiven. The German shepherd lay on a blanket in the back, her head lifted just enough to keep both amber eyes on the bundle of towels tucked against his jacket where the 2 puppies slept. He drove with the deliberate care of a man carrying something breakable, every curve a negotiation with gravity and ice. His left shoulder ached, as it always did in cold weather, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him awake to the present. When the town finally appeared, low roofs and pale chimneys breathing into the winter, he turned onto Main and pulled into a narrow lot beside a 1-story building whose windows glowed the gentle yellow of work already begun. The sign read, Sloan, Veterinary. Inside, warmth met him first, then the smell, clean linen, antiseptic, the faint animal musk, of a place where living bodies came to be put right again. A woman looked up from the counter and took in the scene with a single practiced glance. The tall man with the stillness of someone who had learned when not to move, the big shepherd on a blanket, the 2 small lives tucked close to his chest. "You're early," she said, and there was no reprimand in it. Her voice was level, precise. Dr. Mallory Sloan was in her early 40s, with chestnut hair pulled into a low knot that stayed out of her way, a face that held both sharpness and kindness without contradiction. Her eyes, dark and observant behind thin frames, did not ask for a story first. They went straight to the body. "Back room," she said, already moving, and Wyatt followed, heart steadying itself to the rhythm of a place where order still mattered. He laid the shepherd onto the stainless table, as instructed. The dog's frame, large and muscular even in injury, tensed, ears pricking. She was all lines and discipline under a coat of black and tan so dark along the spine it seemed to drink light. Wyatt kept one hand near her shoulder, not restraining, simply present. She let him. Dr. Sloan worked with a speed that was not hurry. She examined the thigh, fingers tracing the edges of the wound without pressing where it would hurt. "Not a clean tear," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Impact," repeated. She checked the paw, the reflex, the warmth. "You did well to warm her first. Cold would have hidden the bleeding, shock too." She moved to the puppies, her expression softening into something almost private, as she listened to their tiny hearts, assessed their skin, their breathing. 3 weeks, maybe a little less. Hypothermic, but you caught it early. She met Wyatt's eyes for the first time. They'd have had minutes, not hours. He nodded. He did not say what it had been like to count breaths in the dark. He did not have to. He noticed the way the shepherd tracked Dr. Sloane's hands until Wyatt shifted closer, and then the tension in her shoulders loosened a fraction. A choice had been made in the night, and it was holding. Dr. Sloane reached for her phone and, with a clinical matter-of-factness that carried weight, photographed the injury from several angles. "Documentation," she said when she saw Wyatt's glance. "Medical record. If this turns into anything more than care, we'll need it." She removed the old wrap he had fashioned and replaced it with something cleaner, more secure. When she lifted the dog's collar to inspect beneath, a small, dulled tag caught the light. The engraving was faint, the metal scratched by time or by something harder. She tilted it. "Holt," she read, or part of something longer. She made a note. A voice drifted in from the waiting area, warm as a kitchen in winter. "If that's another shepherd, Mallory, I swear the town is conspiring to give you a second job as a therapist." The woman who appeared in the doorway was slight, her hair a soft halo of silver in a low bun, round glasses perched on a kind face that had learned to hold humor and grief at once. June Halverson had run the bakery 2 doors down for longer than anyone could remember. She wore an olive sweater under a flour-dusted apron and the sort of calm that came from knowing every story in a place and loving it anyway. She took in Wyatt with a glance that was neither curious nor invasive. "You look like someone who found more than he was looking for," she said gently. Wyatt almost smiled. "That's one way to put it." "Isn't it always?" June said, then crouched to peer at the puppies with the reverence of someone who had held too many first mornings and too many last nights. "Oh, you poor little commas," she murmured. "Not quite sentences yet." Dr. Sloane finished bandaging and stepped back. "I'm keeping her for a few hours for fluids and pain management. The puppies, too. Warmth, monitored feeding." She met Wyatt again, this time not as a clinician, but as a person. "I need to ask a hard question. Are you planning to return them to whoever Holt is?" Wyatt did not answer immediately. He looked at the shepherd, at the way her eyes followed his, the way she had not once taken them off the bundle in his jacket since he had carried them through the door. "I went looking for a door," he said finally. "I found a life. I'm not handing it back to whatever put that wound there." June made a small sound of approval that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been edged with something older. "In Brindlewood," she said, "we have a saying. People don't always do the right thing, but sometimes they do the next right thing. That's how a town keeps its soul." Dr. Sloane nodded. "Then here is the other hard part. Without a witness, without registration or a microchip, I can't call animal control and have them act today. But I can keep records, I can photograph, I can file, and I can tell you that injuries like this," she gestured at the shepherd's leg, "do not come from a fall in the snow." She tapped the note where she had written Holt. "This is a thread, not a rope. Yet." They waited while the IV went in, while the puppies were settled into a warmed crate with a soft pad that looked like a cloud someone had folded. The shepherd watched everything. When Wyatt stepped back, she tried to rise, the injured leg protesting. He was there without thinking, palm open at her chest. "You're safe," he said, and it was not a promise so much as a description of the moment. She leaned into his hand for a heartbeat, then, as if remembering herself, stood alone. About a third of the way through the morning, when the clinic had quieted into that midday lull where the world holds its breath between appointments, something small and inexplicable happened. Wyatt had gone to the sink to wash. His hands when he felt the shepherd's gaze like a weight. He turned. She had managed to sit upright despite the IV line, and she was staring at the collar in Dr. Sloane's hand with an intensity that made the room feel narrower. Then, with a deliberate care that was almost ceremonial, she lowered her head and pressed her muzzle once against Wyatt's wrist, exactly where his watch rested. It was not a nudge for attention. It was not pain. It was placement, as if she were aligning something that had been out of order. Wyatt's pulse jumped. Dr. Sloane froze. June, watching from the doorway, crossed herself without realizing she had. No one said what they were thinking. They did not need to. The moment did not explain anything, but it rearranged the room around a single, strange gravity. "You are part of this now." Dr. Sloane broke the silence first, practical to the core. "She'll need antibiotics, rest, limited movement for weeks. The puppies will need feeding every few hours for a while. I'll print a schedule." She smiled at Wyatt with a tired kindness. "I've seen men with medals flinch at this part more than at anything else." He huffed, the sound dry. "I can follow a plan." June grinned. "You hear that, Mallory? He's got charts." They walked back out through the front, where snow had begun again in that polite, persistent way that pretended to be gentle while it changed everything. Wyatt waited while Dr. Sloane finished paperwork. She handed him a packet, thick with instructions and the promise of more questions. "Call me if anything changes," she said, "even if you think it's nothing." Her gaze held his for a second longer than necessary. "Especially if you think it's nothing." He thanked her. He thanked June when she pressed a paper bag into his hand. Bread still warm, the smell of yeast and comfort a small miracle. "For strength," she said, "and for remembering that you're not alone, even when you are." They returned to the back room to collect what was now his to carry. The puppies were tucked into their crate, bellies rounded with their first real warmth. The shepherd stood with effort, steadied by Dr. Sloane's hand and Wyatt's presence. When they stepped outside, the town seemed to watch them without eyes. A few faces behind glass, the bakery's bell chiming once as someone came and went. Wyatt loaded the crate into the truck, then lifted the shepherd carefully, mindful of the bandage, of the way her body had learned to bear weight and pain without complaint. She did not fight him. She did not surrender either. She was simply there. As he closed the tailgate, June called after him, "Wren, can I call you that? If you ever need a place to warm more than hands, you know where the ovens are." He nodded, not trusting his voice. He drove back up the ridge with the care of a man who has accepted a different kind of mission, one that would not end with a report or a ribbon. The cabin appeared through the trees like a thought he had once had and forgotten how to reach. He carried them inside. The stove was still warm. The world for the moment was enough. He laid the shepherd down by the hearth again, arranged the crate beside her so she could see and smell her children, and sat on the floor with the packet in his lap. Outside, the snow wrote over the road. Inside, 3 breaths braided into something that felt like a beginning. Wyatt did not know what Holt would come to mean or what doors it might open that he had not planned to walk through. He knew only that when the night had asked quietly for help, he had answered, and now the morning was asking something else, that he keep answering. The morning came in clean and bright, the kind of winter sun that makes the snow look less like sorrow and more like a promise kept. Wyatt drove down from the ridge with the windows cracked just enough to let the cold sharpen him awake. In the back, the German shepherd lay on her blanket, the bandage at her thigh bright against her dark coat. The two puppies were nested in a padded crate beside her, their small bodies rising and falling in a fragile, synchronized rhythm. Since the clinic, she had allowed no one but Wyatt within the perimeter of her children. Her amber eyes followed every turn of the road, every shadow that slid across the truck's cab. Brindlewood at mid-morning was a study in winter restraint. Low storefronts, frost-bright sidewalks, a bell over the bakery door that chimed with a gentleness that felt deliberate. Wyatt parked on Main, checked the puppies once more, then lifted the crate and shouldered the shepherd carefully, mindful of the leg. She did not resist him. She was a large, powerfully built animal, even in injury. Black and tan fur, dense as armor, ears alert, a working dog's posture written into her bones. People noticed. They always did when something wounded passed through a place that pretended not to look at wounds. He began with the collar. Dr. Sloane's note said the engraving might read Holt or be part of something longer. Wyatt stepped into a small hardware store first, then a feed shop where the smell of grain and leather carried the memory of better seasons. He asked quietly. He did not lead with accusations. He did what he had learned to do when a truth needed to surface without being forced. He listened. Most people shook their heads. A few frowned, as if a half-remembered thing had brushed past them. At the bakery, June Halverson slid a cup of coffee across the counter and tilted her head toward the collar. "Holt," she said, testing the word like a stone in her mouth. Could be a surname, could be a company, could be someone who doesn't like to be remembered. She smiled the way she always did when she meant something more than she was saying. "Try the West End, old place near the snowmobile lot. If anyone around here pretends not to be seen, it's from there." The west end of Brindlewood was quieter, the buildings set farther apart, paint fading into the same winter gray. Wyatt found the address in a short row of duplexes with narrow porches and a windbreak of scrubby pines behind. He set the crate down just inside the open tailgate, kept the shepherd beside him, and walked to the door. The knock sounded louder than it should have in the thin air. Caleb Voss answered on the third knock. He was in his mid-40s, tall without being imposing, hair dark and neatly combed, a 5 o'clock shadow that never quite became a beard. His face had the kind of angles that looked better in photographs than in motion, all clean lines and controlled expressions. He wore a charcoal coat over a light shirt, gloves tucked into one pocket as if he had just arrived or was about to leave. His eyes took in Wyatt, the truck, the dog, and something behind them that he did not name. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice measured, polite in the way people are when they want to remain so. Wyatt held up the collar. "Found her on my porch last night. Injured. 2 puppies with her. This was on her neck." Caleb's gaze flicked to the tag. The moment was brief, barely the time it takes to blink, but it was enough. Something tightened and then smoothed over. "Not mine," he said. "I don't own a dog." "You're sure?" "Positive." He kept his hands visible, palms open, a gesture that could have meant honesty or simply a man's desire to appear harmless. "Even if it were, I couldn't take it. Dogs are a lot of work. Noise, damage. I don't need that." Wyatt watched his face as he spoke. He had learned, long ago, to listen with his eyes. There was no overt hostility there, no tremor in the voice, no sweat, just a careful distance. "She was hurt," Wyatt said. "Not by a fall." Caleb's mouth made a small, sympathetic shape. "I'm sorry to hear that. Truly. But you have the wrong man." He leaned slightly into the doorframe, the posture of someone who felt the ground under him was firm. "If you're looking for someone to blame, I won't be your convenience." Wyatt did not argue. He nodded once. "If you remember anything," he said, and left it there. Behind him, the shepherd had risen despite the bandage, her ears forward, eyes fixed on the man in the doorway with a steadiness that did not waver. For a heartbeat, the cold between them seemed to hum. Caleb met the dog's gaze and then looked away first. He stepped back, closed the door with a final, quiet click. Wyatt stood a moment longer, listening to the house's interior sounds, the distant rattle of a heater, the thud of a footstep, then returned to the Ikes truck. He drove not to the cabin, but to the small police station near the community hall. The building was square and practical, its windows fogged with the warmth of people doing ordinary work. Inside, the officer on duty, a man named Peter Ames, with a thinning mustache and eyes that had learned the arithmetic of a small town, listened without interruption as Wyatt explained. Peter glanced at the shepherd through the glass, at the puppy's crate. "Without a witness," he said, choosing his words, "and without a microchip or registration, we can't compel anyone to take custody or open a case today. I can file a report. I can note the injuries. If there's more, later, we'll have something to stand on." Wyatt nodded. He had expected this. He was not looking for shortcuts. He was looking for a line he would not cross. "File it," he said. Outside, the cold felt sharper for the warmth he had left behind. He sat on the tailgate for a moment, the shepherd at his side. Her body angled toward the crate as if her presence were a wall nothing could pass through. He ran a hand once along her neck, felt the steady heat under the fur. "We tried," he told her, not as an apology, but as a statement of fact. They stopped at the bakery on the way out of town. June poured another coffee and listened to his brief account with the kind of attention that did not require him to perform his disappointment. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people throw things away so they don't have to see who they are." She slid a small bag of pastries across the counter toward the puppy's crate, then paused, smiling at herself. "For later," she amended, "when they're old enough to sin." The road back up the ridge felt longer than it had in the morning. The snow caught the light and scattered it like glass. Wyatt drove with both hands on the wheel, the weight of a choice settling into him in layers. He had asked the question. He had heard the answer. The world had done what it often did, offered no clean handholds. About 2/3 of the way home, the shepherd stirred in the back. Wyatt slowed, glancing in the rearview mirror. She had pushed herself up again, her injured leg trembling, nose lifted to the air as if catching a scent that did not exist on the road. He pulled over, hazard lights ticking in the cold, and stepped out. The wind cut through his jacket, sharp and awake. The dog's eyes were not on him. They were on the tree line to the west, where the snowdrifts curved into the shadow of the pines. She did not bark. She did not growl. She simply stared, utterly still, and then, with a deliberate calm that felt almost like instruction, she lowered her head and touched the side of the truck with her nose twice before returning her gaze to the trees. Wyatt stood in the road with the winter humming around him, a strange, weightless certainty pressing at the edges of his thoughts. It was not that he believed in signs. He believed in patterns. He believed that bodies remembered what minds tried to forget. He had seen it in men. Now he saw it in an animal who had dragged herself through the night to a single porch light and would not let go of whatever had brought her there. He climbed back into the truck without following her gaze, but he did not forget where it had fallen. At the cabin, he carried them inside, set the crate by the stove, and helped the shepherd down onto her blanket. She circled once, carefully, then lay with her body curved around her children. The room was quiet in that particular way that only snow can make. Wyatt took the packet Dr. Sloan had given him from the counter and unfolded the first page. Feeding times, medication dosages, movement restrictions. He read it like a map. He made the decision not with a speech, but with an action. He found the forms Dr. Sloan had mentioned, temporary custody, intent to foster, and filled them out at the small table by the window, his handwriting precise, each letter a commitment. He did not think of himself as a rescuer. He thought of the way doors opened and closed, of the way a life could hinge on something as ordinary as a signature. When he finished, he placed the pen down, and crossed to the hearth. The shepherd's eyes met his, the amber deep and steady. He extended his hand. She sniffed it once, then pressed her muzzle into his palm, the contact light and sure. The puppies shifted, made small, dreaming sounds. Outside, the ridge held its breath under a blanket of white. Inside, a man who had learned to live with loss learned quietly how to choose again. The days that followed were not dramatic in the way storms were dramatic. They were smaller, steadier, built from hours that had to be carried one by one. Wyatt learned the sound of hunger in a creature that could not yet bark, the faint, insistent whisper the puppies made before their bodies remembered how to ask for what they needed. He learned the careful choreography of moving through a room so as not to startle a mother whose world had been reduced to the distance between her nose and her children. He learned, above all, how much attention it took to keep something alive when the cold had already tried to take it. He set up the cabin like a command center, not because he wanted to be in control, but because control was how he made room for care. The stove became the sun around which the small universe revolved. The shepherd lay on her blanket by the hearth, black and tan coat catching the firelight, her injured thigh wrapped in clean bandage that he changed on schedule with the precision of a man who trusted lists. The puppy's crate sat within her line of sight, padded, warmed, the door always open. Wyatt taped Dr. Sloane's feeding times to the cupboard, wrote medication dosages in block letters on the fridge, and set alarms on his watch that chimed softly in the night. He slept in fragments, boots by the bed, waking before the sound fully formed, moving through the dark with a quiet that surprised even him. The work was intimate in ways he had not anticipated. Feeding the puppies meant holding their small bodies just so, learning the angle of a mouth barely formed, the pause between swallows. The first time one of them fell asleep mid-feed, milk beating at the edge of its lip, he laughed, an unguarded, startled sound that filled the cabin, and then seemed to hang there, as if the walls themselves were surprised to hear it again. He spoke to them when the night was long, not in the voice he had used on patrol, but in something softer, telling them about the snow, about the light that would come if they could just wait. He did not tell them about the things he had lost. That he kept for later. June Halverson visited on the third morning, bringing a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon and a stack of towels folded with the care of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for other people's messes. She stood in the doorway for a moment, eyes warm behind her glasses, taking in the scene. "Well," she said, surveying the charts on the fridge and the neat line of supplies by the counter. "I always knew you had it in you to run a space program." She stepped closer, peered into the crate, and made a sound like a benediction. "Look at them, already writing their own small rebellions." Wyatt huffed, embarrassed by the pleasure he felt at her approval. "Dr. Sloane gave me instructions." "And you followed them," June said. "That's the rare part." She knelt by the shepherd, who lifted her head but did not bristle. "Hello, brave girl," June murmured, offering the back of her hand to be sniffed. The dog accepted the greeting with a solemn dignity that felt like a pact. June glanced up at Wyatt. "You know," she added softer, "care has a way of thawing things we didn't know were frozen." Dr. Mallory Sloane came later that afternoon to check the wound. She arrived with the quiet efficiency of someone whose life had taught her to make every movement count. Chestnut hair in its low knot, sleeves already rolled, eyes scanning for what could go wrong before it did. "Let's see how our patient is doing," she said, professional but kind. She taught Wyatt how to cut the bandage so it wouldn't pull at the fur, how to clean without reopening what the body was trying to close. "She startles at certain sounds," Wyatt told her, watching the way the shepherd's ears flicked at the clink of metal when Sloane set her tray down. I think she learned what hurt." Dr. Sloane nodded. "Trauma leaves a map," she said, "not just in the mind." She adjusted the wrap, then met Wyatt's gaze. "You're doing well, better than most first-time fosters." "I'm not a foster," he said before he could stop himself. A corner of her mouth lifted. "No," she agreed, "you're not." They settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for cleaning and feeding, afternoons for slow, careful movement. Wyatt encouraged the shepherd to stand, then to take a step, praising with a low voice that carried no pressure. When she wobbled, he did not rush her. He placed his hand near her chest, a reminder that gravity was not an enemy if you met it at the right angle. She learned the distance from blanket to water bowl. He learned the shape of her trust. The cabin, once a place of stillness that had bordered on emptiness, began to breathe. It breathed with the soft sounds of puppies discovering their voices, with the low sigh of a dog easing into sleep, with the click of a watch alarm that no longer felt like an intrusion. Wyatt found himself tidying without thinking, moving the tools he had always kept within reach to make space for something that needed room to grow. He caught himself humming once, a habit he had lost with the woman who had known how to laugh at his seriousness and love it anyway. About a third of the way through the week, something small but unsettling happened. Wyatt had just finished changing the bandage when the shepherd stiffened, head snapping up, eyes fixed on the open doorway. There was nothing there, only snow, the ordinary hush of winter. But she did not relax. She rose, careful on the injured leg, and moved between Wyatt and the puppies with a deliberate calm that was not fear, but warning. He followed her gaze into the white and felt a prickle at the base of his neck that had nothing to do with temperature. The moment passed. She lay back down. The cabin returned to its quiet, but the air had changed, subtly, like a room, after a door has been opened and closed. He did not tell himself stories about it. He told himself what he knew. Bodies remembered what minds tried to forget. Still, that night, he slept with the porch light on. The humor found them again the next day. June returned with more towels and a comment that would become legend in the small kitchen. "You've got feeding times, medication times, movement windows. What are you, coordinating satellites?" Wyatt, bent over the crate with a bottle, did not look up. "I don't want to miss anything." June laughed, a sound that made the room feel larger. Dr. Sloan, on the phone with the supplier, caught the tail end of it and smiled without interrupting. For a moment, the world was simple. 3 women and 1 man orbiting a need that had no patience for pride. The shepherd's startled responses began to map themselves clearly. The clink of metal, the snap of a belt, the slam of the wood stove door. Each time, her body went rigid. Breath, shallow, eyes searching for the source of a harm that was no longer present but not yet gone. Wyatt noticed, and he changed. He hung his belt on a hook away from her line of sight. He closed doors with a gentleness that would have looked like affectation to anyone who did not understand the physics of fear. He learned to set tools down on cloth, to move like someone walking through a sleeping house. In adapting to her, he found himself adapting to a softer version of the man he had been. One night, exhaustion finally broke through his careful order. He slept deeper than he had since the first storm, and in that sleep he dreamed of his wife, of the way she had stood in this very kitchen with flour on her cheek, of the scarf she had wrapped twice around her neck before stepping into a winter that had taken more than either of them had known how to give. He woke with a sound in his throat he did not recognize. The room was dark but not empty. The shepherd lay at the side of the bed, her body angled so that she faced the door, a living threshold. When he shifted, she did not startle. She simply watched him with eyes that held no question, only presence. Wyatt sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in years did not swallow what rose in him. He let it move through his chest and out into the quiet. He did not hide from it. He did not apologize. The shepherd remained, guard and witness both. When the wave passed, he rested his hand on her head. She did not pull away. The days grew brighter, the cold less punitive. The puppies began to show small, ridiculous preferences. One favored the left corner of the crate, the other the right, as if already staking claims on a world they had nearly lost. Wyatt named neither, waiting for something that felt earned. He carried them outside for brief moments when the sun was high, letting them feel the light on their fur, the difference between cold and warmth, teaching their bodies what to remember. It was on one of those afternoons that the chapter shifted. Wyatt had just brought the puppies back inside when the shepherd erupted into sound. It was not the casual bark of a dog announcing a passing squirrel. It was sharp, urgent, the voice of an animal who had learned the cost of delay. She was on her feet, injured leg protesting, body angled toward the back of the cabin, eyes locked on the yard. Wyatt followed without thinking, boots in hand, heart finding a cadence it had not known in years. Outside, the snow lay smooth except for a set of impressions near the tree line, boot prints, fresh, not yet softened by wind. He knelt, touched one, smelled the air. Beneath the clean cold, something bitter threaded through it. Gasoline. He stood, pulse quickening, and scanned the white. Nothing moved. The prints led toward the pines and disappeared. He went back inside and closed the door, slow, deliberate, the way he had learned to when the world had shown him a crack. The shepherd did not settle at once. She paced, then returned to the crate, placing her body between whatever lay beyond the door and the lives that now depended on her. Wyatt knelt beside her, the edge of the moment still bright in him. He did not know what the tracks meant. He knew only that something from before had brushed the present, and the present had not looked away. When evening came, he fed the puppies, changed the bandage, checked the locks without making a ceremony of it. The cabin glowed with the small light of things that had been tended. He sat by the hearth, the shepherd's warmth at his side, and listened to the snow begin again. If the world beyond the door was not finished with them, he would not be finished with it either. He had not set out to be brave, he had set out to keep 3 lives alive. Somewhere between the lists on the fridge and the quiet guard at his bed, that had become enough. The morning after the footprints, the ridge held a brittle stillness, as if winter had paused to listen. Wyatt stood at the window with a mug he had forgotten to drink from, watching the light skate across the drifts. The German shepherd lay by the hearth, her body angled protectively toward the puppy's crate, but her attention was elsewhere. Since the night before, she had been restless in a way that did not belong to hunger or pain. Her amber eyes kept returning to the same sliver of forest beyond the cabin, ears pricking at sounds Wyatt could not hear. He had learned, in these weeks of tending, the difference between a dog unsettled by noise and a dog pulled by something older. This was the second kind. He did not leash her at first. He opened the door, boots crunching into the cold, and let her step onto the porch under her own power. She moved carefully on the injured leg, favoring it without complaint, nose already lifting to taste the air. The smell of gasoline he had caught the night before was faint now, but there were other notes braided through the cold. Rust, damp wood, old rope. She turned toward the tree line without hesitation, not quick, not panicked, certain. Wyatt followed at a respectful distance, mindful not to crowd a choice that was not his to make. They moved through the pines where the snow lay thinner, shadows pooling between trunks. The shepherd's posture changed as they went, head lower, steps measured, muscles remembering a map her mind might have preferred to forget. This was not magic. Wyatt understood that. He had seen men react to the smell of oil or the scrape of metal with the same sudden, terrible clarity. Trauma did not announce itself with explanations. It pointed. The path ended at a sagging structure half swallowed by the woods, a storage shed that might once have served a logging crew or a snowmobile outfit. Its roof bowed under a quilt of snow, the door hung crooked on a single hinge. Wyatt stopped short. The Optge shepherd did not. She approached the threshold, sniffed the air, then stepped inside, with the gravity of a soldier entering a room she had been trained to fear. The interior was dim and close, the air thick with the odor of old iron and something sharper that stung the back of Wyatt's throat. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut across a clutter of neglect, coils of rope stiff with age, a rusted barrel, burlap sacks collapsed in on themselves like tired lungs. On a workbench, half buried under dust, lay the remains of a snare, wire twisted into a loop, the kind used to catch what is not meant to be seen. His jaw tightened. Near the wall, he found a pile of empty feed bags stamped with a company logo he did not recognize. And there, pinned beneath a splintered board, as if the building itself had tried to keep it, was a laminated card. An ID badge, edges cracked, a photograph bleached by time. The name was smeared, but the insignia was intact, a construction firm he had heard, mentioned in town in connection with the new resort planned for the valley. The shepherd watched him from the doorway, her body a line drawn between the world beyond and whatever truths lay inside. Wyatt crouched, gloved fingers tracing the wire. He did not need imagination to understand what had happened here. He needed only to remember the way the dog had flinched at the snap of metal, the way she had placed herself between danger and her young. He rose, scanning the space for anything that might speak, if he asked the right question. He almost missed the place where the snow did not sit, quite right along the back wall. The drift there was thinner, disturbed. He knelt, brushed away the powder, and struck something hard with the knuckle of his glove. A hollow sound answered. He dug with care, uncovering the corner of a small metal box, its lid sealed with a rusted latch. The shepherd stepped closer, nostrils flaring, then halted, as if some boundary had been crossed. Wyatt worked the latch free and lifted the lid. Inside lay a disorder that had been made by human hands and then hidden by human fear. A bundle of photographs wrapped in plastic, a notebook swollen with damp, and a sheaf of folded papers spotted with mildew. The photographs showed the valley in different seasons, equipment staged at the forest's edge, a series of structures half built, and then, abruptly, gone. In several frames, a familiar silhouette appeared at the margin. Black and tan, ears erect, a dog caught mid-motion. The notebook was a ledger of sorts. Dates, locations, quantities noted in a cramped hand. There were entries that referenced clearing and relocation, and others that made Wyatt's stomach drop. Loss, containment, no report. The papers beneath were permits, some expired, some stamped with a corporate seal that matched the ID badge. None of it was a smoking gun on its own. Together, it was a map of things done where no one would look. Wyatt closed, the lid, heart steadying into a familiar cadence. He did not feel triumph. He felt the weight of a door opening onto a corridor he had once sworn he was done walking. "You led me here," he said quietly, not to the box, but to the dog who had stopped at the threshold. She met his eyes, then glanced back at the forest as if to say, "I did not choose what was done. I chose where it was remembered." He did not take the box immediately. He photographed what he could with his phone, careful to capture context, to leave the space as he found it. He did not want the absence of something to become a story someone else could tell. Only then did he lift the metal box and carry it outside, where the light was honest. About a third of the way back toward the cabin, the air changed. It was subtle, a thickening, a sense of being observed that had nothing to do with sight. The shepherd slowed, then stopped altogether, hackles lifting along her spine. She did not bark. She did not growl. She simply turned her head toward the trees, eyes fixed on a point Wyatt could not see. He froze. For a long second, the world held its breath. Then, from somewhere beyond the pines, came the faint sound of an engine. Distant, idling, then gone. The shepherd looked back at him, and in that look was not fear, but instruction. He did not follow the sound. He did not need to. The moment had done what it came to do. It had told him they were not alone in what they had found. He returned to the cabin with the box tucked beneath his arm, set it on the table, and called Dr. Mallory Sloan. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady as ever. He described what he had found without ornament. There was a pause at the other end, not long, but heavy. "You understand what you're holding," she said finally. "I do. This will bring attention you didn't ask for." Wyatt allowed himself a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Trouble has always known where to find me." Dr. Sloan exhaled. "Don't do anything alone. I'll reach out to someone I trust. Federal Land Management. They'll know what to do with permits and projects. Until then, secure it. And be careful." He promised nothing he could not keep. The afternoon drew itself long. He hid the box in a place the shepherd seemed to approve of, behind the false panel beneath the table where his wife had once kept winter scarves. The dog watched, then settled by the hearth, body angled as always between the world and the lives under his care. The puppies stirred, unaware that the quiet of their new home had been brushed by a larger story. Near dusk, a shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. Wyatt saw it through the window before the dog did. A man standing where the trees thinned, posture casual, hands in the pockets of a charcoal coat. Caleb Voss did not step closer. He did not wave. He simply stood and looked, as if measuring the distance between himself and a door he had not been invited to open. In the failing light, his features were all angles and restraint, the neat line of his hair catching the last pale sun. He had the look of a man who preferred control and resented being forced into daylight. The shepherd rose in a single, fluid motion. She did not bark. She did not lunge. A low sound gathered in her chest, barely audible, a warning that was less noise than vibration. Wyatt stepped to the door and did not open it. He met Caleb's gaze through the glass. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Caleb inclined his head, a gesture that might have been courtesy, might have been something else entirely, and turned back toward the trees, his figure dissolving into the gray, as if the forest had decided to keep him. Wyatt did not pursue. He did not need to. He stood with his hand on the latch, feeling the old mathematics of risk and responsibility arrange themselves inside him. The dog remained at his side, the low sound in her chest easing only when the clearing was empty again. He closed the door and drew the curtains. The cabin filled with lamplight, with the small domestic sounds that had become a kind of sanctuary, the click of the kettle, the soft breaths from the crate. Wyatt knelt beside the shepherd and rested his forehead against hers for a moment, a gesture of thanks that required no words. "We'll do this right," he said. Outside, the ridge surrendered to night. Inside, 3 lives slept in the orbit of a man who had not gone looking for a fight, but who would not look away from what had been placed in his hands. The storm returned the way grief sometimes does, without warning, without apology. By late afternoon, the ridge had disappeared into a white curtain, the wind building its own language against the walls of the cabin. Wyatt stacked more wood beside the stove and checked the latches by habit, his movements precise, unhurried. The German shepherd watched from her post near the door, black and tan body still as a carved thing, amber eyes tracking every change in sound. The puppies slept in their crate by the hearth, small bellies rising and falling, the fragile center of a world that had narrowed to a single room. When the power went, it did not flicker. It died cleanly, a sudden absence that left the cabin in a different kind of quiet. Wyatt waited a beat, listening for the familiar click of the grid correcting itself. Nothing came. He crossed to the breaker panel with a flashlight, tested the switches. They were still set. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the stove kept its patient. Fire. "All right," he said to no one in particular, and set about the work he knew. He lit the lanterns, moved the puppy's crate closer to the hearth, layered towels for insulation. He kept his voice low, not because the storm required it, but because the shepherd did. She stood between him and the door, not blocking his movements, simply existing as a line no one crossed without permission. The night had taught her what doors meant. He had just finished adjusting the bandage on her thigh when the first unnatural sound cut through the storm. Not the wind, not a branch. A metallic tap, deliberate, followed by the scrape of something hard against wood. The shepherd's ears went forward. A low vibration gathered in her chest, the warning that was less noise than gravity. Wyatt did not answer it with force. He answered it with preparation. He extinguished one lantern and left the others burning, shadows falling into places that would confuse a hurried eye. He slid the table a few inches, just enough to open the false panel beneath it where the metal box now lay hidden. He checked his phone. No signal. The storm had swallowed more than electricity. He tapped the recorder app anyway and set it on the counter. Screen dimmed. Mic alive. He took the camera from the drawer and angled it toward the door. None of it felt dramatic. It felt necessary. Outside, a voice carried through the wind, muffled but human. Wyatt. The name was shaped carefully, as if the man speaking it did not want it to be heard by anyone else. We just want to talk. The shepherd shifted her weight, injured leg tucked under her, ready despite pain. Wyatt laid a hand on her shoulder, not to restrain, but to share the moment. No, he said, and meant both the word and the life he had chosen inside this storm. The handle turned. It did not give. A second voice joined the first, closer, sharper. We know you found something. You don't understand what you're carrying. The sound of metal against the latch. Testing. Wyatt did not answer. He did not announce himself as anything other than what he was, a man in a cabin with 3 lives that could not defend themselves. He moved the puppy's crate farther from the door, behind the stove's brick shadow, and knelt to secure the panel beneath the table. The shepherd followed his motion with her eyes, then did something that made his breath hitch. She stepped away from the door, limping with intention, and crossed to the far side of the room, placing herself where she could be seen through the window as if she were alone in the house. The low sound in her chest faded. She looked back at Wyatt once, and in that look was not fear, but instruction. He understood. Distraction. The handle jerked again. Wood creaked. Snow forced itself through the seams. You don't want trouble, the first voice said, louder now. We can take the dog and be gone. Wyatt's jaw set. He did not step into the frame of the window. He did not raise his voice. He reached for the phone, steadied it against the counter, and whispered the date and time. He angled the lens just enough to catch the porch. Outside, a figure moved, tall, coat dark against the storm. A second shape hovered at the edge of the light. The shepherd held their attention, body taut, eyes bright. A sudden blow hit the door. Not a full ram, more a test, a promise of what could come. The latch shuddered. Wyatt moved without haste. He slid the deadbolt into place, braced the frame with the bar he had kept for winters when snow tried to turn doors into suggestion. He scanned for the route he had already planned. The back window, the drift that fell away into the trees, the line of sight he could use if he had to vanish with what he carried. The second voice cursed, sharp and ugly, then went quiet. Footsteps moved across the porch. The shepherd shifted again, a ghost of motion that pulled them where she wanted them to look. The storm hid everything else. This was the moment, about a third of the way through the night, when the world narrowed to a single choice. Wyatt could meet force with force, could open the door and let the past speak the language it had once taught him. Or he could hold the line the way he had sworn he would, by keeping the vulnerable alive, by letting evidence be the loudest thing in the room. He chose the second without ceremony. He slid to the back of the cabin, cracked the window just enough to listen. Through the wind he caught a fragment. "Get the dog first." Another, "The box." The words cut clean. He lifted the metal box from its hiding place, wrapped it in a towel, and pressed it into the hollow behind the stove bricks, a place he had prepared and hoped never to use. He sealed it with practiced hands. When he turned back, the shepherd had returned to the door, her role complete, eyes on him now. The latch gave a fraction under renewed pressure. The door bowed, but held. Wyatt raised the camera again, framing the porch where the figures moved, their shapes distorted by blowing snow. He spoke quietly into the recorder. Attempted forced entry. 2 individuals, seeking dog and documents. He let the words exist where they could not be unsaid. A thud sounded at the side of the cabin. The second man had circled, testing the back. Wyatt moved, placing himself between the puppies and whatever might come through the walls. He did not feel fear the way he once had. He felt focus, the same calm that had carried him through darker nights, now anchored to something softer and stronger than survival. Inside the storm, a phone vibrated in his pocket. No signal, but a notification pushed through, a missed call time-stamped seconds earlier. Dr. Mallory Sloan. He tapped back, typed a single line where the connection flickered alive. At my cabin. 2 men, trying to take dog and evidence. Power cut. The message went. The phone went dark again. Outside, the voices rose. Frustrated. "Open the door," one shouted, the civility gone. "You can't keep her." Wyatt stood still. "I can," he said, just loud enough for the recorder to hear. Something struck the window, then slid away. The shepherd barked once, a sound that cut through the storm like a blade, then fell silent, her body coiled. Wyatt reached out, felt the heat under her fur, the tremor of pain she refused to show. Minutes stretched. The men did not break in. They tested, retreated, returned. They were not there to make a spectacle. They were there to retrieve. When they did not, when the storm refused to be their accomplice, they withdrew the way predators do, without announcement. The wind swallowed their departure. The ridge returned to its white roar. Wyatt did not move for a long time. He listened for the echo of footsteps that did not come. He waited for the kind of quiet that meant absence, not ambush. When he finally crossed to the door and lifted the bar, he did so with care, opening just enough to let the storm in. Snow rushed across the threshold and then was gone. The porch was empty. Tracks led into the dark and vanished. His phone buzzed again. 1 bar, a call connected, thin but alive. "Wyatt," Dr. Sloan said, her voice urgent and steady. "I'm with Ranger Ellis, Federal Land Management. He's already called the county. They're en route." Relief did not crash into him. It settled, the way a weight does when it has been carried long enough to feel like part of the body. "They tried to take her," he said, "and the box. Hold what you have. Don't open the door for anyone until law enforcement is there." He promised. The sirens arrived as a suggestion before they became sound, red and blue bleeding into the storm. The county truck ground its way up the drive, followed by a dark SUV with government plates. 2 officers stepped into the wind, coats pulled tight. With them came a man Wyatt had never seen before. Tall, spare, face cut with lines that looked carved rather than aged, eyes the color of winter water. Ranger Ellis introduced himself in a voice that carried without needing to be loud, took in the doorframe, the latch, the snow-scored porch. He listened as Wyatt played back the recording, as the camera showed 2 figures moving in the storm, as the words, "Get the dog first," and "the box" came back into the room. Ellis nodded once. "You did exactly what you should have done." Wyatt retrieved the metal box from its hiding place and set it on the table. The shepherd did not approach. She watched, posture protective, as if measuring whether the world had earned what it was about to be given. Ellis opened the lid with gloves on, eyes scanning the contents with the practiced calm of a man who had learned to see patterns where others saw clutter. "This changes things," he said quietly. Outside, the storm continued its long argument with the mountain. Inside, something had crossed, a threshold. The officers took statements, photographs, prints from the latch. They did not linger. The ridge was no place for ceremony. When they left with the box, and with a promise that did not require faith to hold weight. This would not disappear into a local drawer. Wyatt closed the door behind them and leaned against it, feeling the night pass through him. The shepherd came to him, pressed her head into his thigh with a firmness that was not request, but recognition. He knelt and wrapped his arms around her, careful of the wound. In the quiet that followed violence without having to become it, he understood something simple and fierce. Protection was not the absence of danger. It was the refusal to let danger decide what kind of man he would be. The puppies slept on, unaware of how close the world had come to breaking them again. The stove ticked. The lanterns glowed. Outside, the storm spent itself on the dark. Morning came to the ridge with a softness that felt almost deliberate. The storm's violence spent into a pale, steady light. The snow lay unmarked again, as if the night had been a story told, and then folded away. Wyatt stood at the window with the same mug he had carried through so many cold hours, watching the first color touch the trees. The German shepherd lay near the hearth, her body no longer coiled for defense, but arranged in a long, unhurried line, the injured thigh wrapped in a fresh bandage that no longer looked like a question. The puppies, now sturdier, stirred in their crate with the small, impatient sounds of lives that had decided to continue. The house felt different, less like a bunker, more like a place that could be entered without fear. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised the town. Ranger Ellis returned with colleagues from federal land management, men and women whose faces carried the quiet seriousness of people accustomed to walking into complicated rooms. They did not arrive with spectacle. They arrived with clipboards, evidence bags, and an attention that did not flinch when it found what it was looking for. The permits from the metal box were matched against records. The ledger's entries were traced to sites in the valley where the forest had been cleared without proper reporting. The photographs were aligned with satellite images that revealed a pattern of work done and then erased. Dr. Mallory Sloan's medical files, the documentation of the shepherd's injury, the photographs taken with the care of a clinician who knows that truth often has to be preserved before it can be believed, became more than a footnote. They were read, cross-referenced, folded into a narrative that did not need outrage to be compelling. The abuse was no longer a rumor. It had dates, methods, places. It had a name for what had been done. Wyatt was called in once, then again, to answer questions that were precise and unadorned. He spoke the way he always did when something mattered. In facts, in sequence, without dramatizing the danger he had refused to meet with violence. He did not describe himself as anything more than a witness who had chosen not to look away. When asked about the night of the second storm, he explained how he had secured the cabin, recorded what he could, and protected those who could not protect themselves. The agents listened. They took notes. They did not ask him to be a hero. They asked him to be accurate. The town learned in fragments at first, conversations in the bakery, a notice on the community board, a line in the local paper that spoke of irregularities in a development project, and an ongoing inquiry. When the story became impossible to keep small, it did not arrive as a scandal so much as a correction. The resort planned for the valley was halted pending review. Contractors who had operated in the margins were named. Charges related to animal cruelty were filed based on the veterinary records and corroborating evidence. The forest, which had never had a voice in town meetings, was suddenly being spoken for. Brindlewood responded the way small places do when they are asked to decide what they believe about themselves. June Halverson turned the bakery's front window into a ledger of kindness. Chalking dates and amounts for a fundraiser, she announced with a humor that did not hide its purpose. For the shelter we should have had all along. She baked in the hours when the sun still made the snow look friendly, and she baked in the dark, flour on her cheek like a benediction. People came who had not spoken to one another in years, left bills folded the way you fold a promise, lingered to look at the photographs of the puppies that Wyatt taped to the counter, because June said stories needed faces. Dr. Sloan offered long-term care for the shepherd at a cost that was mostly symbolic, explaining with a small, determined smile that medicine was a calling before it was a business. Neighbors who had once waved from their trucks now arrived with posts and wire, hands red from cold, building a fence that curved around the cabin's yard like an embrace. Someone constructed a small insulated shelter near the tree line, not a kennel, but a place of choice, a retreat for days when the wind made the house feel too close. The shepherd healed with the patience of an animal who has learned that time can be trusted again. Her gait grew surer, the favoring of the injured leg becoming a memory rather than a necessity. The tremor that had once moved through her at the clink of metal softened into a glance, then into nothing at all. She watched the work in the yard with a dignity that seemed less about command and more about belonging. The puppies, who had once fit in one hand, now tested the boundaries of their world with clumsy courage. They discovered the fence, the line of pines, the way snow felt different under paws than under boots. They learned the sound of Wyatt's voice when it meant come, when it meant wait, when it meant you are safe. Naming them was not an event. It happened the way some truths do, without ceremony. Wyatt had been repairing a hinge on the new shelter when the shepherd approached, sat and placed her head against his knee with a gravity that felt like consent. The word rose in him without effort. Aurora, for the light that comes when the night has done its worst and must yield. He spoke it aloud, not to test it, but to accept it. The dog lifted her head, amber eyes catching the winter sun, and the name fit as if it had always been there. For the puppies, he chose small names that carried their own kind of hope, Grace and Ember, one for the gift of survival, the other for the fire that had kept them alive. June pretended to argue with him about sentimentality, and then embroidered the names on a set of blankets she claimed were strictly utilitarian. About two-thirds of the way through those early days of light, something quiet and astonishing happened. Wyatt was sorting through the last of the papers the agents had returned, copies he was allowed to keep, reminders of a story that no longer belonged to him alone. When Aurora rose from her place by the hearth and went to the wall where a single photograph hung, it was the picture of his wife he had kept there since the winter he had learned how to breathe without her. He had always treated it like a boundary, a marker of what had been and what could not be again. Aurora stood on her hind legs just enough to reach it, touched the frame with her nose, and then looked back at him. There was no urgency in the gesture, no fear, only an invitation. Wyatt crossed the room slowly. He had not moved that photograph since the night it went up, had not known how to carry memory without letting it become a weight. He lifted the frame, held it at the angle where the light did not glare, and felt the familiar. Ache, clean, precise, no longer sharp. He set it on the mantel beside the small things that had begun to gather there. The ledger June had given him with the fundraiser's final total written in her looping hand, the veterinary report with Dr. Sloan's neat signature, the scrap of fencing wire that had once been a snare and was now only evidence. The photograph did not look like a shrine among these objects. It looked like what it had always been meant to be, a light by which to walk forward. He spoke to the quiet in the room as if it were a person who could hear him. "I still remember you," he said, "and I am living?" Aurora settled at his feet, the simple fact of her presence making the words less like a vow and more like a description of the day. The town came up the ridge on a Saturday that felt almost like a holiday. There were thermoses of coffee, a basket of biscuits from June, a set of hand-carved nameplates someone had made in a garage down on Main. Children stood at the fence and learned the difference between approaching a dog and being invited. The agents did not come. Their work was being done elsewhere now, in offices and courtrooms, in the slow language of accountability. What came instead was something older and rarer. Neighbors who had decided that what had happened here would not be allowed to vanish back into the snow. Wyatt watched from the porch as Grace tumbled into Ember, and both were righted by Aurora with a patience that looked like love. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. The life he had chosen was speaking for him in every ordinary detail. The bowl filled at the right time, the gate latched, the door opened to those who came in good faith. The man who had once believed that survival was the highest good understood now that survival was only the beginning. When evening fell, the ridge took on its blue shadow again. The lanterns were not needed. The light inside the cabin was enough. Wyatt sat by the hearth with Aurora at his side, the puppies curled into their small, ridiculous shapes at her flank. He looked at the photograph on the mantel one more time, not with the ache of a man measuring loss, but with the steadiness of someone who knows where he is going. Outside, the forest stood, patient and unafraid. There are hearts that believe they are finished when winter comes. There are doors we close because we think we cannot afford what waits on the other side. But sometimes all it takes is a life that arrives shivering on a porch, sometimes 3, to teach a man how to open what he thought was sealed. In the white of dawn, in a town that learned how to be itself again, Wyatt Callahan found that grace does not ask for permission. It asks only that we make room. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive as thunder or a burning bush. Sometimes it comes as a scratch at the door on a freezing night, as 3 trembling lives placed in the only patch of light they could find. And if there is a signature of God in the everyday world, it may be this: the right hearts are guided to the right porch at the right moment, not because we are perfect, but because grace refuses to let love be late. In ordinary life, most of us are not asked to be heroes. We are asked to be faithful in small things, to notice what others overlook, to offer warmth when the world is cold, to choose kindness when it would be easier to turn away. A cup of coffee shared, a hand held in silence, a door opened instead of locked. These are quiet prayers, and God hears quiet prayers. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell where you are watching from, or tell us about a moment when God met you in an unexpected way. And if you want more stories of love, redemption, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He place courage in your hands, peace in your home, and light on your path. And when a small miracle finds your doorstep, may you recognize it, and may your heart be brave enough to open the door.